Good morning if you're in the West Coast, and good afternoon if you're in the East Coast. My name is Baki Tezcan. I teach history at the University of California in Davis, and I am the convener of the What's Up in Ottoman and Turkish Studies series, brought to you by the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. Today, our panel is on Ottoman environments. As those of you who are kind of like my age might remember, once upon a time, there was not much about environmental history in the Ottoman Empire. But then came our, back then, very young colleague, Alan Mikhail, and kind of created this field. Of course, there were others too. I should not do injustice to others, but we have to all recognize the field of environmental history within Ottoman history owes a whole lot to one person, and that is our colleague, Alan Mikhail. The way in which he produces his work, his productivity, is somewhat beyond my comprehension. It's amazing. His books speak for themselves. Nature and Empire in Ottoman Egypt, 2011, received Mesa's Roger Owen Book Award. The Animal in Ottoman Egypt, 2014, was followed by Under Osman's Tree in 2017, that received our own Fuat Köprülü Book Prize. And last year, Alan published God's Shadow. So not only did this field come to being in the last 10 years, thanks to many people's work, but so much for Alan's. It now has so many books that we can actually have two books in one What's Up panel that relate to Ottoman environmental history. So that is why this panel is going to be chaired by my colleague, Alan Mikhail, who, among many other of his accolades, is his amazing award, the Anneliese Meyer Research Award, given by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Both the price tag on this award is very amazing, and the fact that in Germany, they picked him to internationalize their humanities and social sciences. So that is very amazing for him, for Ottoman history, for environmental history, in Ottoman history. These are all great developments for our field. I'm so happy and proud to be able to introduce to you Alan Mikhail. And Alan, please take over. I'm going to stop my share and let you introduce the panel.
Thanks so much, Baki. That was exceedingly generous of you. Hi, everyone. I'm really honored and pleased to be able to be with you here today on a day between a conviction in Minneapolis and the day before Earth Day. We are here to celebrate and discuss two new books in the fields of Ottoman environmental history broadly construed, books that address issues of empire, infrastructure, from different temporalities and new geographies for Ottoman history. The books are Rivers of the Sultan by Faisal Hussein and Imperial Mecca by Michael Christopher Lowe. I will introduce the authors and our discussant very lightly to afford us as much time as possible to hear from them and to hear from the discussant, and then to have a conversation. Our first presenter will be Michael Christopher Lowe, who's assistant professor at Iowa State University, has published widely in different venues in Middle East studies, legal history, and environmental history. His articles have won numerous prizes, and his book is out from Columbia University Press. Second will be Faisal Hussein, who is assistant professor at Pennsylvania State University, has also published a set of robust articles that have won numerous prizes. And then our discussant will be Zozan Pehlevan, who is assistant professor at the University of Minnesota, who is the recipient of a Guggenheim a melon, and numerous other distinctions. Also has an article published in Gesho most recently, and is working on a book on climate and violence in Kurdistan at the end of the 19th century. So I will turn the floor over to Chris. We will hear from him for about 15 minutes, and then Faisal, and then Zozan, and then we will open the floor for discussion. Chris.
Thank you very much. Here we go. Can everyone see my slides okay? No problems there? So thank you very much for the very generous introduction and for putting this together, both Baki and Alan. It's really a pleasure to be here presenting with some of my very favorite colleagues, both in Ottoman history and in environmental history. So today what I'd like to do, I would just say that Imperial Mecca is at its core, at its heart, histories of disease and environment are sort of the beating heart of this book. But it's a book that takes on sort of many different forms as it goes along. But I'll sort of focus my comments on part 2 of Imperial Mecca, Ecologies of Empire, which broadly deals with questions around cholera and water infrastructure. I'd also say that chapter 6, the camel and the rail, is another area where environmental scholarship greatly influenced my work, but for the sake of time, I'll sort of leave that. Perhaps Zozan may have questions for me later on regarding that. So between 1831 and World War I, cholera spread from India to the Hijaz on at least 48 separate occasions. After 1865, but especially between 1881 and 1895, a global cholera pandemic smoldered almost continuously from India to the Mediterranean and well beyond. Throughout this period, cholera remained in almost constant circulation, flaring up for extended periods in virtually every corner of the Ottoman Empire, especially along its Indian Ocean frontiers in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Now, as Alan Mikhail, Nuket Varlik, and Sam White have all pointed out, the early modern Ottoman Empire had its own particular imperial ecology. Agricultural goods and raw materials were constantly being extracted to feed the imperial capital and sustain the Ottoman military's sprawling mobilization. At the same time, however, those very same circuits that mobilized and circulated the empire's crops, livestock, people, and minerals could just as easily convey epidemic diseases, in this case, plague. Likewise, the ecologies of Egypt, Anatolia, and the Balkans were inseparable. Now, at the same time, however, the larger Ottoman ecosystem was also overlapped and penetrated by environmental forces originating well beyond its borders. Indeed, the very idea of empire as an ecosystem points to the artificiality of traditional political spatial distinctions. In the case of cholera, like plague before it, this point is made painfully clear. So here we have a map of sort of the main steamship routes in the 19th century Indian Ocean. So time and again, cholera really lays bare the Hijaz and the Hijaz newly vulnerable position as a kind of trans-imperial nexus of the steamship era, linking the imperial ecologies of India into an almost zone. And of course, we end up with a map, something like this from Basim Omer. Each time that steam-powered cholera leapt across the Indian Ocean and struck the Hijaz, it exponentially raised the likelihood that the disease would bloom across the width and breadth of the empire and beyond as pilgrims returned to their homes, unwittingly carrying the devastating microbes with them. Returning pilgrims also had a way of bringing the instability of the empire's semi-autonomous Indian Ocean frontiers home to the imperial center, laying its biopolitical and environmental insecurity at the feet of power. In both chapters 3 and 4 of my book, I explore how cholera really annihilated the presumed difference between a modernizing Istanbul and a supposedly backward Arabian frontier. I examine how the infrastructures and procedures of sanitary and environmental discipline necessary to contain the death and destruction produced by cholera collapsed time and space and intimately bound the imperial capital to these unruly frontiers. Put slightly differently, cholera had a way of generalizing the frontier. Quarantine and medical surveillance measures were not just a matter of building sanitary checkpoints on desert islands in the Red Sea. Rather, the defenses built up and directed outward against Red Sea invasions of cholera-carrying Indian Ocean pilgrims were merely the most obvious physical manifestation of the disciplinary mechanisms that tracked, diagnosed, and treated suspected victims of cholera. In this sense, the multi-layered practices and infrastructures of medical surveillance and environmental discipline being strengthened in Tanzimat and Hamidian era Istanbul were only as effective as their application and execution at the absolute geographical and logistical margins of the empire. As a result, from the 1860s onward, but really especially from the 1890s, the Hijaz was by no means exempt from the increasingly invasive sanitary and envirotechnical interventions being imposed on the residents of Istanbul and the core of the Ottoman state. The new technologies of bacteriological science, urban sanitation, disinfection, and water safety tested and refined in Istanbul and elsewhere rapidly found their way to the Hijaz and the quarantine sites of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf in places like Cameron Island off the coast of northern Yemen, where I was lucky enough to spend a little bit of time back in 2006, 2007. You see pictures of the ruins of first Ottoman and then later British structures built on the island between 1882 and its eventual closure in 1957. So we can really imagine this opening up an era of really 75 years in which European powers played a really major role in the functioning of the pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, just as individual pilgrims suffered and died under cholera's cruel reign, on a larger geopolitical and administrative scale, the Ottoman Empire was also victimized by this distinctly colonial scourge. Since early modern times, the Ottoman Empire had been managing the fallout from epidemic diseases and natural disasters, from plague to droughts, famines, floods, fires, and earthquakes. Indeed, recent scholarship has pointed to the long evolution and resilience of the empire's. I believe someone needs to mute. In the context of the massive restructuring and modernization of the state undertaken during the Tanzimat and Hamidian periods, however, late Ottoman responses to natural disasters gained renewed significance. As tragic as an earthquake, flood, or fire might have been, these events also represented opportunities. Cholera also brought new opportunities to test the latest envirotechnical tools and infrastructures of bacteriological science. So here we have a picture of autoclaves and disinfection apparatuses. We have quarantines, urban sanitation, and the construction of new sewer systems. Everything from those to the reorganization of municipal water supplies was a sort of response to this empire-wide crisis of cholera. In other words, 19th century disasters opened new spaces, really living laboratories for the experiments of Ottoman modernization. At the same time, however, orchestrating the urban reorganization of Istanbul in the wake of an earthquake or a fire, or even the overhaul of the capital's water and sewer systems, arguably represented more manageable challenges than the vexing inter-imperial puzzle of cholera prevention along the empire's vast and porous southern frontiers. From a purely fiscal and logistical perspective, reproducing even a fraction of the sanitary reforms being pioneered in Istanbul and the state's centralized core, and then transporting them to the empire's southernmost extremities was daunting enough in its own right. But to complicate matters, new notions of bacteriology, urban sanitation, quarantine, passport controls, and disinfection were all met with varying degrees of suspicion and resistance from foreign pilgrims, urban Hijazis, Bedouins, and the Sharif of Mecca himself. On the ground, sanitary reforms and quarantine measures were frequently framed as un-Islamic innovations and further evidence of Europe's growing influence over the administration of both the Hijaz and the Hajj. To a degree, this was partly true. The Ottoman Board of Health was an internationalized body subject to the capitulatory oversight of European representatives. However, it would be a mistake to view Istanbul's imposition of stricter sanitary and quarantine policies as solely a product of European pressure. The medicalization of the frontier was also well suited to the centralizing impulses of Istanbul's Tanzimat and Hamidian statesmen and bureaucrats. Quarantines, increased border controls, and sanitary reorganization of the Hijaz and the wider Red Sea offered the Ottoman state critical opportunities to strengthen its administrative reach and underscore the empire's territorial sovereignty, while ostensibly doing so under the banner of diplomatic cooperation and international legal recognition. Now, on the other side of the ledger, Istanbul's position on the front lines of this international struggle against cholera was a lonely and deeply frustrating one. Unlike earlier instances of disease and natural disaster, Ottoman officials no longer viewed cholera as an act of God. Istanbul had an increasingly clear and precise understanding of cholera as a man-made microbial crisis, produced and exacerbated by rapacious British colonial policies in India. Here we might be reminded of the work of Mike Davis. From Yemen, Hijaz, and Iraq to Istanbul itself, the ecological fallout of British colonialism loomed something like a monsoon cloud sweeping over Ottoman lands. Just as the Hijaz was increasingly subject to the extraterritorial political and legal influences radiating out from the Indian Ocean, it was also equally vulnerable to the explosion of human suffering, poverty, dislocation, and deadly microbes being unleashed by the predations of the British Raj. The combined effects of monsoon failures, drought, famine, malaria, plague, and cholera formed something of a toxic cocktail born out of the Raj's unjust agrarian, environmental, economic, and political systems. Thus, the deeper that British India sank into its own ecological crises, the more that the Hijaz and the broader Ottoman ecosystem bore the brunt of its steam-powered collateral damage. Ottoman authorities, of course, did their best to leverage the weak mechanisms of international diplomacy to protect the empire and Europe itself from the disaster largely of Britain's creation. Yet even as international scientific opinion coalesced around India's position at the epicenter of the global cholera pandemic, Ottoman officials found themselves embracing the latest works of Koch and Pasteur, but were confronted with a British colonial state virulently opposed to accepting the emerging bacteriological consensus surrounding cholera's transmission, and equally determined to deny their own culpability in the creation of the crisis or their further responsibility to mitigate its tragic effects. Now, although European observers viewed Mecca primarily through the international lens of cholera and quarantine, from my time in the archives, for Ottoman administrators, an additional yet inextricably linked responsibility was the provision of enough safe, potable drinking water for both pilgrims and permanent residents. So here in chapters 3 and 4, we have a sort of global crisis, but when we get down to the more local scale, we're talking about these infrastructures down to the level of water tanks, latrines, wells, pipes, etc. Now, as a result, one of the most important findings of my research was that Ottoman analyses of the Hijaz's public health often moved along a more localized set of axes, dedicating much more attention to the Hijaz's water supply and repair and upkeep of the region's aqueducts, water tanks, cisterns, pipes, and fountains. So we see a real disconnect from the previous historiography around this sort of internationalized diplomatic question around international sanitary conferences and quarantines. And this is really something that has been ignored in the growing literature on both the pilgrimage and mobility in general. Now, Ottoman reporting also conveys a much stronger sense of the mutually reinforcing relationship between the region's susceptibility to water scarcity and its vulnerability to waterborne disease. We really get some remarkable finds too. So in many respects, water was also a microcosm of Istanbul's incomplete projects of modernization and state building on the empire's Arab peripheries, leading to some quite stunning interventions, like the construction of an early desalination plant in Jeddah, something of a forerunner of what would become, Saudi Arabia as the sort of preeminent desalination power on the planet. Now, water questions, to my mind, really sit at the intersection between these European international pressures surrounding cholera, but also more localized questions around drought and the inter-imperial connection between mobile pilgrims, Bedouin disorder, and then the inability of the state to fully impose its will on the Arabian desert, the supposedly defective environment of the Arabian desert, and the semi-autonomous Emirate of Mecca. Ultimately, the autonomous nature of the Hijaz was a technical problem that the Ottoman state could not fix with science, medicine, infrastructure, telegraphs, or even the much vaunted Hijaz Railway. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. We will now turn the floor over to Faisal Hussein.
It's an honor to join Chris and Suzanne on the same panel. And I would like to thank Pocket John for organizing this event. more importantly, I would like to thank Alan Mikhail for kindly agreeing to grace our panel as moderator. I wouldn't be here without Alan, so his presence means a lot to me. My book is basically a history of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the Ottoman Empire. I went to the archives with the very basic question, what role, if any, did the Tigris and Euphrates play in Ottoman history? And I was surprised by how much I was able to find, that I ended up limiting the focus of the book to what we call the early modern period, roughly between the 16th and 18th centuries. Let me introduce the rivers to you first. This map gives a holistic view of how they look like. So the Euphrates River flows on the west, and the Tigris flows east. The Tigris and Euphrates are normally called twin rivers, primarily for three reasons. One reason the Tigris and Euphrates are called twin rivers is because both of them emerge from the same geological womb. And that geological womb is the Taurus Mountains in what is now southeastern Turkey. So both rivers emerge in this mountain system, and they flow until they drain in the south into the Persian Gulf. The other reason the Tigris and Euphrates are called twin rivers is because, like all twins, they both share a birth date. In geological history, both the Tigris and Euphrates were born around the same time, roughly between 35 and 20 million years ago. Lastly, the Tigris and Euphrates are called twin rivers simply because they look and behave in very similar ways. They both flood in the spring months between March and May, and also they both sink low in the late summer and early fall. Of course, like all twins, we're fortunate to know in our family and social circles, the Tigris and Euphrates have their own differences that make each one unique in its own way. Still, their shared genealogy and their shared birth date and their shared habits give us enough justification to call them twin rivers. One thing I want you to keep in mind before I move on from this slide is to note that for most of history, until the introduction of steam navigation in the 19th century, the Tigris and Euphrates were primarily used for navigation only downstream from north to south. So for example, the Euphrates was more or less navigable from the town of Birajik in southeastern Turkey. Oops, I'm still learning how to annotate with PowerPoint. So it was navigable from the town of Birajik in southeastern Turkey all the way to the Persian Gulf in the south. And the Tigris was also the same, operated the same way. So the Tigris was navigable more or less in its entirety from the city of Diyarbakir, southeastern Turkey, all the way to the Persian Gulf in the south. The geography of upstream navigation was much more limited. And so, for example, ships that wanted to sail upstream on the Euphrates could do so up to this point only, around the town of Hilla in southern Iraq. Likewise, on the Tigris, ships could not go far beyond the provincial capital of Baghdad on the Tigris, right? And even within this small geography of upstream navigation for most of history until the 19th century remained extremely difficult and extremely costly and time-consuming, primarily because of prevailing northerly winds and river rapids that ships encountered as they sailed upstream into the Iraqi interior. Now, the challenge is to learn how I will erase those annotations. All right, so I think I am, second. Right. So I hope by now we have some of the basics of the Tigris-Euphrates system, and especially the issue of navigation will be very important to the argument that I will describe very shortly. For most of history, the Tigris-Euphrates basin was politically fragmented between very different states. In the early 16th century, however, the conquests of Selim I and Suleiman I placed the reins of the Tigris-Euphrates basin in the hands of the Ottoman Empire. And this map gives a view of the Ottoman state around the middle of the 16th century. And if you notice that the Tigris and Euphrates system, more or less from mountain to sea, flowed within the boundaries of the Ottoman state. And that's when the story of my book begins in the early 16th century, because now you see a central administration based in Istanbul, working actively with settlements along the river channels from upstream to downstream to coordinate mostly navigation, but also to some extent irrigation in ways that you never see before in the history of the region. And I argue in the book that the Ottoman unification of the Tigris, Euphrates mattered a great deal, mostly during the 16th and 17th centuries, because it solved a chronic ecological imbalance along the Ottoman eastern borderland. Let me explain this ecological imbalance, and then I will explain how political unification of the river channels helped the Ottoman state to solve it. Within the area between the provincial capitals of Mosul and Baghdad, the latitude 35 degrees north runs. So this is the red dotted line that you see in front of you between Mosul and Baghdad. Above this line, mountainous terrain captures higher precipitation, and distance from the equator attenuates evaporation from the soil and transpiration from plants. The net result of those conditions was that Ottoman provinces north of this line enjoyed a moist climate that was supportive of forest growth and also supportive of dry farming. For those who are not familiar with what dry farming means, it means farming with rainfall rather than irrigation waters. The situation south of the line could not be more depressing compared to the happy situation in the north. So here, south of the line, aridity thins out the vegetation cover and makes irrigation an imperative for food production. So if you wanted to be a farmer and settle down south of this line, you really could not count on rainfall. You had to grapple with the Tigris and Euphrates system to manage to secure your water through irrigation. So this is one component of the ecological imbalance that the Ottoman state encountered as it arrived into the region in the early 16th century. Another component of the ecological imbalance had less to do with the 35 degrees line and more to do with the natural distribution of ore deposits from which people could extract useful metals. Due to the tectonic structure of Asia, ore deposits happen to be widespread north of the line and to be in extreme scarcity south of the line. And this further widened the mineral wealth gap between Ottoman provinces in the upstream region and the downstream region. So let me summarize the ecological imbalance that I just described, the Ottoman state faced from the early 16th century. So the Ottoman state faced a deep gap in the organic wealth of its provinces along the eastern borderland. So the upstream region had abundant ore deposits, abundant rainfall, and abundant forest, while the downstream region was plagued by the scarcity of all of those resources. And I argue in the book that the Ottoman Empire relied on unified river channels, mostly and most importantly, to solve this ecological imbalance through regular shipments, mostly of three resources, of grain, metal, and timber, from upstream regions of surplus in Anatolia and the Jazeera to downstream regions of scarcity, mostly in Iraq. So let me take you through those shipments that the Ottoman state organized to appreciate their magnitude. So one commodity that the Ottoman state was involved in its redistribution, taking the advantage of unified river channels under its authority, was grain. And the Ottoman state regularly delivered grain from north to south, mostly in the form of wheat and barley. And the reason that the Ottoman state bothered with the redistribution of this basic commodity was because with grain and barley, it could feed and maintain larger garrisons in the lower river basin, especially in Iraq, which was a strategic frontier zone with Iran, the Persian Gulf, and the deserts of Syria and Arabia. The other commodity that the Ottoman state redistributed, taking the advantage of its command over the river channels, was metal. And the Ottoman state delivered regularly throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, metal from the north to the south, mostly in the form of arms, be it artillery, firearms, or ammunition. And the reason the Ottoman state bothered with that also, because with those arms, the Ottoman state could equip its garrisons in the lower river basin, mostly in Iraq, with the latest weapons at the time, gunpowder weapons, which were critical to maintain an Ottoman military edge in this strategic region of its empire. Last but not least, the Ottoman state took the advantage of its ability to command navigation along the river channels from north to south to redistribute timber from its areas of surplus in the Anatolian forests, mostly Malatya and Marash, to downstream regions of scarcity where timber could scarcely be found, mostly in Iraq. And it delivered this resource mostly in the form of rivercraft. And with rivercraft, the Ottoman state could dispatch even more grain and more arms, and also more men from north to south to the southern portion of its eastern frontier. Right. So let me restate my argument in case most of you have fallen asleep already. For most of the 16th and 17th centuries, this imperial system of waterborne communication that I just described, which was built around the unified drainage basin, solved the ecological imbalance between upstream and downstream provinces and anchored the Ottoman presence in the eastern frontier, especially in Iraq. I have about 2 minutes, so I will conclude with one historiographical note. I'm not the first person to write about the Tigris and Euphrates in the Ottoman period. A few scholars did before me. The two most influential pieces and most important pieces, in my opinion, one was written first by Cengiz Orhonlu and Turgut Işıksal in the early 60s, an excellent piece, but it focused mostly on the Ottoman use of the rivers for navigation, mostly. And Cengiz Orhonlu was a pioneer of communication networks in the Ottoman Empire. The second piece that I, in my opinion, extremely important to the field is one written by Rhodes Murphy, and it focused mostly on the Ottoman use of the rivers for irrigation purposes. So both of them are very complementary. What I benefited greatly from both pieces. What I tried to do different, of course, aside from the fact that my output is a book, so I had an opportunity and privilege to have a more comprehensive coverage of themes and to incorporate resources, archival resources that were not available to Murphy and Orhonlu and Işıksal. But more importantly, the book makes a new and very important point, which is that the Ottoman Empire had a changing relationship with the Tigris and Euphrates. And especially, I point out the turn of the 18th century as a turning point when the empire-wide trend toward provincial autonomy localized the management of the Tigris and Euphrates within the Ottoman state, and shifted its command post from the imperial center in Istanbul to the provincial capitals. So now, throughout over the course of the 18th century, you see this shift when provincial capitals, mostly Baghdad, calling the shots about how the rivers should be used for navigation and irrigation. And at the same time, the imperial center in Istanbul would disengage from getting involved in the day-to-day management of the rivers, as they used to do in the 16th and 17th centuries. I must say that I'm not the last person who will talk about this topic. Much more work has been done already, and I expect even more will come by graduate students working on the subject. So I will conclude here and leave the floor to Suzanne for her commentary.
Thank you, Faisal. Thank you to you and Chris again for introducing us to your really, really important new books. And it's my pleasure now to turn the floor over to our colleague Zozan Pahlavan to offer us her comments on the books and your presentations.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this panel, Baki. I am really grateful. And thank you, Faisal and Chris, for writing these wonderful books and making an important contribution to the field of Ottoman history. And thank you, Alan, for being the chair of the panel. So before I begin to my comments, I just want to commemorate two colleagues that we lost in early March. The great historian Mehmet Genç, the economic historian, and later then a very young colleague and friend of mine, Yavuz Sezer, who got coronavirus and passed away in mid-March. And I would like to commemorate both of them today. So for the panel, my comments are going to be short. I'm not going to summarize the entire two wonderful books, just a few comments and two major questions, I guess. So I will start with Chris's book. So what Chris does in the context of Imperial Mecca, he offers new ways of understanding the Ottoman state in Hijaz in the late 19th century by demonstrating the role of technocratic expertise, state building, and developmentalism. And I think this is the most important contribution in my view to the recent literature. Chris also fills major important lacuna in the historiography around the Ottoman management of the Hajj from Süreyya Faruqi to Gülden Sarıldız. His fine research in this regard offers important new directions and new claims. So the second major lacuna that he fills, he ties to this broader connection of Ottoman Empire to the Indian Ocean world. He places the Ottoman Empire in the context of a changing Indian Ocean world in the age of steamship, mobility, cholera, El Nino, famine, and imperialism. As Chris has shown, managing the Hajj in the long 19th century becomes a major problem for the Ottoman Empire, for the central Ottoman state. Istanbul becomes directly implicated in the Hajj due to regions changing political and as well as technological and environmental framework. So the British were in Aden. The Ottomans had lost much of its Christian population in other areas. So Abdülhamid II, the Sultan Abdülhamid II, saw the possibility of putting pressures on the British and Russians by asserting his claim to be a religious, preeminent Muslim ruler and controlling the holy cities. All of these elements became kind of new pressure points for the Ottoman system and led to increased centralization. So in terms of environmental history, Chris's work demonstrates a fine balance between environment or environmental crises or disasters or public health question, and the state, the role of state, the role of central state in management of environmental crisis or public health crisis that even today we have. And making this meeting actually. So including the state's role in management of hazardous, these risky, changing socioeconomic and environmental conditions. So in terms of question, I do have a question. So one of the criticism's major thesis is that Pan-Islam is less important than technocratic engineering in the Ottoman management of the Hajj. So the empire, the entire project of Hijaz, like railways, steamship, these infrastructures, water canals, and so on and so forth, these all are engineering technocratic plans. The Abdul Hamid state is a very technocratic state, as Chris has shown. So, and these are all happening at the same time. So what Abdul Hamid II is kind of shifting the empire's geography and culture towards the Muslim population. So what I was thinking is that you can have a pan-Islamist movement that is technocratic, actually. So in my opinion, these are not kind of mutually exclusive entities. So it doesn't need to be either kind of Islamist or technocratic. It could be technocratic pan-Islamism. So I might be wrong, but this is my question. So is being a technocrat the opposite of being an Islamist or pan-Islamist? Can one not be both? So this is my kind of major question for you. And I have a kind of common question for both of you, but I will say when I finish my comments for Faisal's as well. So in Rivers of the Sultan by Faisal, it's just a fascinating work. I was kind of amazed to see the amount of Ottoman archival material that he extensively used, like dozens of muhimmes and all records from Kamil Kepeci collections, Mukata records, and so on and so forth. It's just like a huge, very impressive collection of archival materials. And this is, of course, not the only kind of source in the book. So in addition to these extensive Ottoman documents, Faisal also uses chronicles, local accounts, local histories, as well as scientific, like a massive scientific literature on animal husbandry, agronomy, sedimentation, and technological studies. So it's a covering wonderful, extremely rich, detailed for an understudied area of the empire. So in terms of like knowledge, like it provides an excellent, it is an excellent empirical study for Iraq. So I was particularly intrigued by the role that Kurdistan plays in the making of early modern Iraq. What it seems to me, without Kurdistan, Iraq wouldn't exist in early modern world. So this is what Faisal shows at the same time. This is a moment of transition in trade and imperial politics. So I would like to see the linkages and the integration between Kurdistan and Iraq, both economically and environmentally. So Iraq, like Iraq's timber, copper, large amount of wheat, were all coming from the Kurdish and Armenian residents of Kurdistan. So timber was coming from the mountains of Kurdistan that Turkey is burning these days. So, and it was the basic material for building houses and boats. So this is a very important connection that Faisal shows, and the amount of goods that being shipped downstream is crucial to understanding the economic and environmental portrait of this whole region of whole region at the time in early modern period. So I was curious how much material was coming downstream from Kurdistan to Iraq in terms of especially timber, wheat, and copper. So Faisal also provides like a really fascinating study regarding the urban and kind of marginal groups or pastoral nomadic or wetland residents. So with regards to the state-sponsored herders associations, that's what he describes, the Ahshamat and Jemasat that have been established first, like the Ahshamat for pastorals and the Jemasat for the buffalo herders in wetlands. I was wondering, could you please describe them a bit more regarding their taxation status and so on and so forth? So what it seems to me with these associations, as you have shown, like these marginal areas became more manageable and in terms of taxation and in terms of governance for the Ottoman state. There was a mix of kind of central as well as the local state. So what type of autonomy did pastoralists or the buffalo herders have at this time in Iraq? Is it a military autonomy, or is it a fiscal autonomy? Is it political, or both, or all of them? So regarding the central state's role, it's in this entire story of these mobile individuals, mobile communities in Iraq. It seems to me that the relationship between these groups and the state was constantly kind of changing. So the mobility was not only happening in water, but the water of Tigris and Euphrates. The mobility was also happening between states and these communities. So there was so much change in the entire relations between this state throughout the early modern world. So, like, as you know, like Halachol already has shown that, like, the Ottomans in this period were trying to forcefully resettle these mobile communities, these pastoralist communities in different parts of the world. So my question, why did the Ottomans have a different approach or policy towards pastoralists in Iraq? So, and my last point is, do you think the Ottomans could have done better? So no government, no state is perfect. And this is an early modern state. So the central state is very far away. Like for most of the time, as you have shown, from 1690s onward, it is not even ruling the whole region directly. So Mardin and Nisabin, for example, were part of Pashaluk of Baghdad up until early 19th century. They were not ruled by Istanbul. The central state input in this region is very, very limited. So what it seems to me, the way that you depict the region, the way that you depict the Ottoman central government has been depicted as a kind of important force, an essential, a gorgeous, magnificent force in the region. So, but at the same time, you are talking about Pashaluk of Baghdad, which is a kind of independent, autonomous political entity. So what is the state in the early modern period? And more importantly, who is the state in early modern Iraq? So is it Baghdad, or is it Istanbul, or both? Like who is the kind of the major political figure? Who is the state or who is the ruler in early modern Baghdad? And my last question for both of you, I was kind of wondering Istanbul perceptions of the environment. So in Chris's case, the Bedouins, in Faisal's case, are pastoralists living in this marginal or desert lands, or in Ottoman terminology, or grassland. So how the Istanbul's perception kind of affected, influenced the ecological as well as the economic picture of this region? Because what happens, what you guys describing is that in the desert in Hijaz, or grassland in Iraq, became mountains in Kurdistan. And the Ottoman perceptions towards these so-called marginal areas actually determine the entire political, economic, and environmental structure of the 19th century's region. So, these are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Zozan. Those were very, very rich. I want to offer Chris and Faisal an opportunity to respond to your comments. Before we do that, I just want to direct everyone's attention to how we will be asking questions of our panel. So feel free to use the raise hand function in Zoom, or you can simply write question in the chat and I'll call on you. If you prefer to write your question in the chat and to have me relay it to the panel, that's fine as well. Gather your thoughts and comments and questions, and I will keep the queue. So Chris and Faisal, do you want to respond to anything that Zozan has said?
Sure, I'll go ahead and take the Pan-Islam question. So Zozan, thank you for this really fantastic question. It's something that sort of rattled around in the back of my head in thinking about how to address Pan-Islam. And I'll just say that this was a question that I really kind of struggled with throughout writing the dissertation and the book, sort of how much to address Pan-Islam. And it became something that ultimately I had to confront head on if I was going to write primarily about the Hamidian state. But you know, your question about does it have to be either or? And I totally agree with you that you can be a developmentalist, sort of technocrat, and a Pan-Islamist, certainly. And in fact, a lot of times I had in the back of my mind 20th century dictators who were obsessed with infrastructures while I was reading these documents. But that really hasn't been put forward in the historiography. And all of the causation about Abdulhamid II's thinking tends to sort of be this very lazy, well, but Pan-Islam, shrinking Christian population, need to rebalance sort of internally, and then propaganda directed to the sort of colonized Muslim world. And I saw this exactly the opposite in some respects. So all of the literature on Hajj, it basically says, okay, these colonial empires are afraid of Pan-Islam. They're afraid of Abdulhamid's propaganda and the possibility that he could inspire colonial uprisings. When I read the actual documents, the day-to-day correspondence, in fact, it's the Ottoman Empire that's very, very afraid of British and Russian and Dutch and French interference within the Hijaz through extraterritoriality, through international law, through the day-to-day benefits that these subjects of these colonial empires received via their passports, right? So I think if we look at the sort of nuts and bolts, the causation that we find is actually quite different. Let me give one, I think, critical example. We think of Pan-Islamic Brotherhood and all of this sort of Pan-Islamic imagery, but in fact, in the 1880s, Abdulhamid II wanted non-Ottoman Muslims to be disallowed from owning property in the Hijaz. And this sets off, you can see the tension, right? You need stronger borders and sovereignty, but you want to have a supranational outreach to non-Ottoman Muslims. And so this friction, basically in every chapter, I'm trying to sort of get under the skin of all of our assumptions about what the Hamidian state is about, and really get into what I call the kind of quotidian day-to-day mechanics of how the Hajj functions. It wasn't just one big kind of propaganda event. From everything from the Hijaz Railway down to, you know, disinfection stations and, you know, keeping water pipes running. There was this material sense. And in fact, being the Khadam al-Haramain al-Sharifain, in order to be the caliph, there had to be a physical component and a provision of actual resources. It wasn't just this sort of on paper, titular kind of thing, but the historiography thus far hasn't really sort of addressed that. And that's what I was trying to fill in, I think.
Thank you very much, Zozan, for the extremely useful commentary. So I'll try to answer questions quickly to give time for the rest of the audience. So on Kurdistan, and this is really important, and I try to do as much as I can to integrate the upstream regions, many of which were predominantly Kurdish, inhabited by predominantly Kurdish populations. And yes, so Kurdistan, you cannot tell the story of Iraq and under Ottoman rule in the early modern period without Kurdistan. And the most important center in the Ottoman period, the early modern period, was Diyarbakir. And Diyarbakir probably second in importance in the upstream regions after Aleppo. This is where the state established its presence more concretely than Kurdish regions further east. And where you see state institutions more present than elsewhere. And also there's another center, more minor, which is Hassan Cave, but not as important as Diyarbakir. I must say that the book is still doesn't give Kurdistan its due. I could have done more, but the reason I didn't talk as much as I wanted about Kurdistan and focused more on the downstream regions is because for Kurdistan, the issue of navigation, they could use, they relied on the rivers for navigation purposes, right? So that's one very important part of the calculation. But for irrigation, they could not. So for the Kurdish populations of the empire, the rivers were almost irrelevant for irrigation purposes. And that's largely because if you're in the Kurdish region, you don't need irrigation waters. You could have a more sustainable form of agriculture by counting on rainfall. And so people could migrate the transhuman system and the cultivation system happened without regard to the whims of the Tigris and Euphrates. And this was more sustainable for the Kurdish population and less time consuming and created less problems that all the salinization and sedimentation problems that farmers suffered in the South, and they had to suffer them because if you don't invest in irrigation infrastructure in the South, there's no way out. There's not much else to do to grow your crops unless you excavate wells, and those are not very as reliable as relying on river waters. So that's the question of Kurdistan. Very briefly, I could say more. The issue of the Herders Association, yeah, and this was one of my biggest surprises of how heavily involved the Ottoman state was in organizing the mobile pastoral population of the eastern frontier. And so for those who are familiar with Mediterranean history, so Mediterranean powers had different systems of how to organize such an interactable mobile population to extract resources and monitor it efficiently before the age of aerial surveillance, to count all the livestock and be able to intervene in the affairs of this mobile population efficiently. So the most common solution for Mediterranean powers was social, what Jim Scott calls social aggregation. So one way to do it is to organize those separate and small herding groups and bring them together under one imperial umbrella or two or more, and appoint officials with a clear chain of authority so they can report to you. And this way it is easier for the state to be aware of its whereabouts and how and just to improve the efficiency of monitoring and tax collection and intervention in the affairs of this population, which lived a very different life from those who settled and tilled the land, right? So famous examples are in Spain, the Mesta system. So the Mesta was the Herders Association system that Spain established. In Italy, there is another system called the Dogana, was established by the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Naples. A similar system you see established by the Ottoman state in this eastern borderland between Kurdistan and southern Iraq. And the two biggest herders associations that the Ottoman state established to aggregate those separate and small mobile pastoral groups was called the Ahshamat. And this group was specialized in sheep herding. And also the other herders association was called the Jammasat, from Jamus in Turkish and Arabic, which is water buffalo, and those who specialize in water buffalo herding. So the question of autonomy. Yes, so those who were engulfed in those royal clubs, royal pastoral clubs, of course, had to surrender part of their autonomy because now they had the state appointed on them judges that moved around with them wherever they went, and they managed communication with the state. And the state, in some instances, would appoint even officials to be with them and monitor them. And also, above all, the state had knew much more about those who joined those royal herds than others who defied surveillance attempts. So yeah, so those who joined this imperial arrangement had to surrender a part of their autonomy, but at the same time, they enjoyed some privileges that those independent pastoral groups lacked. So three major privileges that those in the royal herders clubs enjoyed and others didn't. One was the freedom of movement within different provincial jurisdictions to herd your livestock without having to manage permissions from different provincial administrations. And this was especially very important for the Kurdish populations that relied for grazing grounds in central Iraq for part of the year. Another privilege that those enjoyed, pastoralists enjoyed in the herders associations was royal protection. So whenever they're attacked by outsiders, by rogue pastoral groups, you see the Ottoman state ordering provincial administrations to wage a military campaign, an expedition, and hunt down those who dared to harass members of the royal herds, because those were protected. Lastly, a privilege those in the herders associations enjoyed and others not much is royal justice. And this was largely through the appointment of imperial judges appointed by Istanbul on those herders associations to listen to their grievances whenever there were they were mistreated by provincial officials, and there are complaints, and we know a lot about those the exchanges between the judges of those herders groups and the Istanbul through royal through the correspondence in the Muhammad Daftars. Lastly, I don't want to talk a lot more. So what is the state? Do I present the Ottoman state as this awesome, wonderful power? And yeah, so this is a criticism that can be reasonably leveled against the book. My answer would be is that, so what is the state, first of all? So is it Istanbul? Is it the provincial centers? Is it the provincial notables? And this is a question we all have to grapple with. And it's not unique to Ottoman studies. Historians of the British Empire ask very similar questions. So what is the British Empire? Is it Her Majesty's government? Is it Bengal and the East India Company? Would you consider irrigation engineers who were deployed in India and elsewhere as part of the British Empire, or go-betweens, those buzzwords that we use? Yeah, so it's an open question. For me, so the provincial administration and the central administration mostly were, for me, represented the state, but it's there's no correct answer to it. I must say that the book is state focused, and because of my interest, I was interested in the Ottoman Empire's relationship with the Twin Rivers. And that's why the book heavily relies on archival material produced by the Ottoman state, right? So yes, it's state focused because I was primarily interested in how the Ottoman state as an important early modern power related to the rivers. So there are, and I think it's difficult to write a more bottom-up history. It's possible, but if it's written, I'll be the first person who would love to read it.
Thank you, Faisal. There's been some discussion in the chat that I thought it might be useful for us to bring out to the group, asking Chris about the administrative status of the Hijaz, his conceptual framework of defensive modernization, perhaps defensive developmentalism. So I wanted to give Chris an opportunity to engage his interlocutors, Professor Salzman and Kocaman.
So let me begin with the question of the status of the Hijaz. I think this is something that really interested me throughout the writing. And there was an assumption, I think, in everything that I looked at, that the Hijaz was sort of a place that was a land apart, right? So exceptional that it was not touched by the Tanzimat reforms. And in some respects, it was set aside. But then in other respects, structures of the Tanzimat state, even when the Hijaz was explicitly excluded from certain reforms, the wider structures of the state sort of grew up around it. And I think that that's something that really sort of captivated me. The other question was sort of engaging with some of my colleagues who are working on international legal questions and the status of autonomous provinces. So my colleague, Amy Janelle, while I was at Columbia, she was working on the Eyalete Momtaze, these privileged provinces. And one of the things that I came to kind of figure out is that, a huge swath of the Ottoman Empire was considered, one of these autonomous provinces. And so the Hijaz, to my mind, as I sort of looked around at comparable places, whether geographically, if you think about Libya or Yemen or Iraq, where sovereignty was quite lumpy, you had tribal authority, sort of semi-autonomous rule. So the Hijaz is not so different from a lot of these other places, right, that had special deals with the state. So I tried to sort of think about what that might mean. And for me, autonomy became kind of the key problem, right? So the environment is one issue, disease is an issue, mobile populations is an issue, but at the root of things, Istanbul can't solve all the problems of the Hijaz because it can't get rid of autonomy. And so Abdulhamid thinks about this. At the beginning of the 1880s, he really does toy with, under the governorship of Osman Nuri Pasha, the idea of centralizing the Hijaz. And some really concrete steps were taken in that direction between roughly 1880, 1882, and 1885. But then he really backs off and starts to say, okay, this is going to be too violent. It's going to require too much manpower, kind of a standing army to do something like this. So ultimately, the autonomous constitutional sort of power sharing between the Ottoman state and the Sharif of Mecca has to stay. But how can we answer this problem of autonomy in an increasingly crowded international imperial environment, right? So autonomy needed to be narrowed in some way. So thus all of these technocratic solutions, right? So Professor Salzman asks about defensive developmentalism, and I think that sort of her second question kind of hinted at the right framing. I get a little frustrated with that Gelvin kind of framing because there was something offensive that was happening in the Red Sea, right? A new kind of state was being built in the Hijaz and Yemen that had never existed before. We have to remember that the Hijaz as a state really had been destroyed by the Wahhabis in the early part of the century. And there was this restoration in the 1850s, but not nearly the kind of state that emerges after the 1880s. So this was something very new, and it was imbued with new Tanzimat impulses, new kinds of centralizing impulses that hadn't previously happened. So when I think of defensive developmentalism, I think of something that's static and reactive. This was a little bit more offensive and a little bit more proactive versus its imperial competitors, and something new too.
Thank you, Chris. There's another question for both of you, and I invite Zozan to answer this as well, from Unwar Inal, our colleague who has done a lot to encourage environmental work in the Ottoman Empire. His question is, did you work with natural scientists or experts that use the quote archives of nature, such as tree rings and sediments?
I think Suzanne will be best positioned. Her recent article on climate history.
Well, what I did, I started with reading just climate rich literature, dozens of them, in order to be sure that I interpreted my documents, and in order to be sure that I interpreted what I was reading, because it's hardcore science what we are reading from the climatologists. I share my work with a professor at Boğaziçi University, Murat Güvenç. He reads my stuff and makes comment, and I think that is a fantastic opportunity for historians to share our work that we are actually understanding, interpreting what we are reading in the climatologists in climate literature.
Chris, do you have anything on that, or?
So in this project, I didn't engage with a sort of natural science. For my new project on water infrastructures in the Arabian Peninsula, I'm increasingly finding that I really need to sort of engage with industry professionals working in the field of desalination. And so this is sort of part of what I'm doing here in Abu Dhabi, is to sort of get my feet wet for this new project that really stretches from the late Ottoman period all the way up to the end of the 20th century. So this is kind of a new terrain for me as well, but I think I'm going to be following in Zozan's footsteps, but just more in the sort of history of technology side of things.
So let me say my bit. Yeah, so I was desperate for recognition by some scientists. And I was able to finally involved in an archaeology conference that was at the University of Chicago, which has the Oriental Institute, a pioneer of the study of the ancient Near East. And this is the discipline that uses all of those natural archives that Onur Inal referred to. And I benefited greatly by talking to them in person and by reading their work. Especially, I benefit greatly by talking to Dominic Fleitman. He is a scholar of speleothems. He excavates speleothems from caves, and this is where Kurdistan comes into play. So he did some excavation. He has a speleothem that he excavated from a cave in Iraqi Kurdistan called Gechkar. And this speleothem, by reading its layers, you can trace back precipitation patterns for a long time. I forgot how many centuries, but it included the 17th century. And before I use it, I want to make sure that I'm not abusing this evidence. And I understood it correctly. So I made this, I begged for a Skype appointment, and we talked, and he reluctantly gave me the green light to cite him.
Okay, we are getting close to time, but if there are other questions on the topic of the panel for our authors and or discussant, please make yourself known. Okay, let's see. So we have two questions. One, the first, my question is for Dr. Hussein. Do you detect some moments of rupture in the management of the rivers and resources? What I have in mind in particular is, for instance, the short-term Safavid capture of Baghdad and other possible administrative or political crises.
Thank you so much, Batul. I'll be very brief. Yes, so reading this, the book, you'll notice that for me, the patterns that were established by Suleiman in the early 16th century, and the law code and the herders associations And the logic of the Ottoman grand strategy didn't change much. So if we call Ottoman policy that was laid down the ground for by Suleiman I in the early 16th century, if we call it Ottoman grand strategy, and I see John McNeil and here who teaches on grand strategy. If we call it Ottoman grand strategy, the brief Safavid rupture didn't change that. And you see immediately after the Ottoman restoration by Murad IV, the imperial decrees issued by Murad and the Ottoman administration continued to refer to how to rebuild things, and they invoked the precedent sent by Suleiman I, and they explicitly mentioned that. So for me, the rupture is really, for political history, yes, the Safavid rupture in the region, interregnum between 1623 and 1638, this is a rupture in political history. But for environmental history, like the account I laid down, it was not much of a rupture. The rupture really came in the late 17th century because largely, I argue, because of major shift of a segment of the Euphrates River, about 100 miles in length, that shifted its course. And for me, that's really the rupture that with it, the Ottoman state had to recalibrate how it related to the rivers. But thank you, Batul.
Faisal, do you also want to pick up the question on how the Ottomans perceived ancient archaeological remains in Iraq? Did you come across any archival sources about that?
Not much in this period. I know that Samuel Dolby, if he's here, he is writing on the Jazeera, and he engages with this discussion, how the Ottoman state viewed itself as a reviver of the precedent of ancient empires like Assyria. And so I'm aware of it through the work of Sam Dolby. But before the 19th century, I'm not aware of a sustained discussion of references to ancient empires, except those cliches like references to Cyrus and nicknames at the beginning of royal decrees.
Thank you. Zozan, did you have a question or comment?
No, I just want to make a correction. I pronounced Murad Turkesh's surname wrong. So his surname is Turkesh, not Güneş. That's what I wanted to make it clarify.
Okay, thank you. So we have time for one more question, and I see Baki Tezcan has a question, so I will give him the floor for the last question.
Oh, thank you. I had a couple of questions to Faisal, actually. The redistribution of lead, the example you gave, I think, was mainly for military purposes. Did they also send, like, in cases of not having enough, in difficult times, famine, etc., did they have a policy of providing additional resources for the population at large rather than just their military? Is one thing I was wondering about, because if they are only supporting their military, I don't know how generous of a policy that would be. And then the other question, I was curious, you said in the 18th century the Baghdad administration actually ended up having more impact than Istanbul in calling the shots. Did that make it more efficient or less efficient?
Okay, so those are excellent questions. So on one point on the deliveries for military purposes, and this is the reason we know about them, because sources related to the Janissaries and the artillery corps, the Tupçu Arabaca and others, we know more about them because they're much better documented than, say, relief efforts for a plague. I am not aware of major events when the Ottoman state would, or the Imperial Council, through its deliberations, would say, okay, there are starving people in this district, and we need to give them some relief effort. The earliest one I'm aware of is on the eve of the French occupation of Egypt, because there were also locust invasions. and Egypt was briefly occupied by the French, so relief could not come from Egypt, and the Ottoman state was scrambling to find an alternative resource to relieve the population in Iraq through grain deliveries. I'm not sure how the outcome of that happened, but yeah, the reason we know much more, and I focused more on the grain deliveries for the army is because they're the best documented deliveries. And this applies not only to the grain deliveries, but also the meat rations and also the clothing rations, part of the Janissary's safety net that regularly, very well documented year by year. And I only use those related to grains to detect this pattern. But there could be instances, but I don't think it would be as systematic as grain deliveries that were made for the army. Last thing, did it make the system more efficient? I would say it resembled the situation that happened in Egypt that Alan documented in his first book in the late second half of the 18th century and early 19th century. It placed greater pressures on local resources than provincial administrations had before. So for example, now we see Baghdad, because it wanted to circumvent the Imperial Center, it would seek alternative resources to solve this, its shortages. And so you see for the first time, Baghdad intensively exploiting the forests of northeastern Kurdistan within what is now Iraq. And also it made Iraq more, Baghdad more dependent on foreign powers, like the British East India Company. Because before, for the Navy, the Ottoman Navy in the Tigris-Euphrates Basin, you could just communicate with Istanbul. You needed timber to build the frigates or galleys and galleons. And the Ottoman state would work with Malatya and Marash to supply all the material and also the know-how from Greece and from the Levant region. But now, to be independent and you don't want to take the advantage of those imperial resources, you needed an alternative. And the best alternative for the Pashalik was in the south, and that was the British East India Company. And you see English personnel and ships built in India being sent to the Pashalik to ensure its monopoly over the Ottoman Navy that Istanbul would lose over the course of the 18th century.
So thank you all for this wonderful conversation. Thank you, Baki and Otsa, for sponsoring this panel. Thank you to Faisal and Chris for presenting your books. Thank you to Zozan for your wonderful comments about the presentations. And thank all of you for being here. I hope you have a great afternoon, morning, or evening.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Faisal. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Zozan. Have a great day, everyone.